There are almost 8 billion people on Earth today, but believe it or not, there are still tons of land masses with no people on them. You might assume these are just tiny little islands with one palm tree like you'd see in a cartoon, and many of them are, but some are surprisingly massive. Some of these islands are simply impossible for humans to get to, others are illegal to try. Today we'll take a look at why so many of these islands still exist, as well as what might happen to them in the future. If you think about it, every landmass on Earth was uninhabited at some point if you go back far enough. Human beings originated around 300,000 years ago in Africa. Obviously, before then, there were no human beings anywhere on any part of the globe. After originating in Africa, we migrated north into Eurasia, and then eventually into the Americas. Harder to reach places like New Zealand and Madagascar were only reached by humans within the last few thousand years. Yet despite enormous population growth, major advances in infrastructure and technology, and constant migration back and forth between crowded cities around the world, human beings have still failed to migrate absolutely everywhere. This has led to the modern phenomena known as desert islands. These are places out in the ocean that we know exist, we just can't go to. It's interesting to realize that the concept of a desert island wouldn't have made much sense to the millions and millions of our ancestors who populated the globe thousands of years ago. For most of our history, we had no idea what the Earth even looked like. Even when Polynesians first arrived on the shores of New Zealand, one of the last places to be populated by humans, most people still thought the Earth was flat. The oldest surviving model of a globe was made in Germany only 500 years ago, long after we'd pretty much reached every spot on the map we could get to. It is only after this point that the idea of an island being deserted really came to mean anything. In the last 500 years, the scientific revolution has allowed us to have a complete picture of the entire planet and recognize the fact that we are all over it and have been for hundreds of thousands of years. In other words, it is no longer normal for us to discover new landmasses that we didn't already know were there. But back when we didn't have a complete picture of the planet, we wouldn't have found it strange to discover a big new landmass with nobody on it, hiding in an area we'd never bothered to go before. In fact, we'd have been more surprised if there were people on it. Who are you guys, and how did you get here before me? One interesting example of this is on the island of Madagascar. Madagascar is 250 miles off the eastern coast of Africa. 1,000 years ago, Bantu people from East Africa made the harrowing sea voyage out to discover this massive new landmass which no one in Africa had ever seen or heard of before. But amazingly, they arrived to discover the island was already populated by completely unfamiliar people, who looked and talked like no one the Bantu had ever come across. They were people from Indonesia, who had sailed an incredible distance of over 4,000 miles to arrive there hundreds of years earlier. We can be certain the Bantu explorers were extremely surprised to discover they weren't the first people to set foot on the new island. But in modern times, our expectations are reversed. Now, wherever there is land, we expect to see people. When we don't, it not only surprises us, but makes us wonder as well, why aren't people here? Abandoned islands have increasingly become part of folklore and popular culture. This almost certainly has something to do with modernization and the fact that nature is increasingly something we go to, rather than simply live in all the time. The idea of a place with no people, no roads, no buildings, nothing man-made is mind-blowing to modern human beings. Most of us never get exposed to an environment like that in our lives. One of the first major works to feature the concept of a desert island was Shakespeare's play The Tempest, which he wrote in the early 17th century. The play tells the story of a shipwreck which leaves the main character, a sorcerer named Prospero, stranded on a desert island with his daughter. The play involves tons of supernatural and mystical forces, and one of its primary themes is theatrical illusion. One of Shakespeare's better-known lines happens during the first scene of Act 4, when Prospero says, "We are such stuff as dreams are made on, and our little life is rounded with a sleep." Like any Shakespeare work, it has been read for centuries and has many different interpretations, but clearly the idea of being stranded on a remote island removed from civilization as we know it was an opportunity for Shakespeare to explore the theme of life being a dream and the impermanence of all things. It might sound a little grim, but the play was clearly quite captivating for audiences when it first debuted. The first recorded performance of The Tempest took place in front of King James himself, and like many Shakespeare plays, it has been performed over and over again for centuries onward. Another major example which came about 100 years later was the famous novel Robinson Crusoe, written by Daniel Defoe in 1719. The book tells the story of a castaway who gets stranded on a remote island for almost 30 years. Although fictional, Defoe could have based the story on the real life of Alexander Selkirk, who Defoe most likely would have read about in a history book that had been published several years earlier. Selkirk was a Scottish seaman who was hired by the United Kingdom to help fight wars in the ocean. At one point, Selkirk and his crew were stationed at an island in the South Pacific called Masa Tierra. Their purpose was to restock on essential supplies and then head out again, but their ship had suffered serious damage and Selkirk was deeply concerned about staying on board. He felt convinced that if they set sail again into the notoriously vast and empty South Pacific Ocean, they would all drown. Selkirk made a shocking decision that may have actually saved his life. He chose to stay on the island of Masa Tierra. The rest of his crew sailed off to their demise. The ship sank, and the few crew members who survived were captured by the Spanish and thrown in prison. Selkirk discovered that he was the only person on the island of Masa Tierra. He lived there by himself for an astonishing 4 years. He had a musket with him, which he used to hunt animals. He also managed to forge knives from the hoops of barrels that had washed up on the shore, and build multiple huts out of plants. Selkirk was finally rescued in 1709, 53 months after he had been left behind. A book telling his story was published in 1712, titled A Voyage to the South Sea and Round the World. The concept of abandoned islands only became more popular in the 20th century. TV shows like Gilligan's Island and novels like Lord of the Flies couldn't be more different from each other in tone, message, or subject material, except for the fact that they're both set on deserted islands. Other more recent examples include the movie Castaway and the TV show Lost. In addition to being an intriguing premise, stories about abandoned islands also provide the opportunity for social commentary. Characters who get stranded on a remote island are always forced to create their own new society with new rules and new restrictions and new possibilities. Depending on how you view human nature, that can either be a receipt for disaster, a receipt for paradise, or something else altogether. As people, we're all naturally drawn to stories that have this kind of meaning behind them. It's no coincidence that Lost averaged over 16 million viewers on every episode and was included in Rolling Stone's list of the 100 greatest TV shows of all time. The more we've become a culture of entertainment, the more interested we've become in uninhabited islands. But along with the cultural interest, we've also become much more able to learn about these islands through advances in technology. Planes and high-powered water vessels allow us to travel in ways that were previously impossible. Cameras allow us to film and photograph the islands from as close as we can get. Whereas early humans probably just assumed there were all kinds of islands and landscapes out there they didn't know about, today we know a great deal about where all the world's islands are located, big and small. We know how islands get formed and how they get swept underwater again. We know what different areas on the globe mean in terms of climate and wildlife. We know the shapes and sizes of these islands and what the terrain is like too. This mastery of the globe has primarily shaped the course of humanity by allowing us to visit islands that are inhabited. The Hawaiian Islands were an independent republic way out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean until 1893. Today, not counting the pandemic, they average around 10 million visitors a year from all over the world. Even Easter Island, one of the most remote locations on the planet, now sees 100,000 visitors a year. Its Moai statues are recognizable to most people today, despite how far away they are from most of us. If we know all about statues that were built all the way out on Easter Island, then we definitely know about all the islands where people haven't been or aren't anymore, or are forbidden to go to. For the first time in human history, we get a complete picture of the world's abandoned or forbidden islands. In some ways, this greatly improves our understanding of this captivating phenomenon. In other ways, it makes the situation even more mysterious and even more intriguing. Islands can be huge. The largest island in the world is Greenland, which is no less than 3 times the size of the US state of Texas. But what about how small islands can be? Here, there's really no set limit anybody seems to agree on. Some islands are so small that barely even a few people can fit on them at one time. In Alexandria Bay, New York, there is an island so small that it can barely fit just one little house on it, making it the smallest inhabited island in the world. The island is located near the Canadian border and is one of nearly 2,000 small islands that are clustered together in the same body of water, Lake Ontario. Since islands can be so small and so many can be scattered all over the surface of the ocean, it's hard to say for sure how many uninhabited islands there actually are. Just in the country of Sweden alone has a whopping 270,000 islands within its own borders, and the vast majority of them aren't inhabited by people. It would be impossible to tell you about all of the world's uninhabited islands, because the mind-blowing reality is there are simply way too many of them to cover. However, at this point, somebody somewhere has accounted for basically all of them in total, and in doing so, some of them have stuck out as being particularly interesting. When you look at places like Sweden, it's easy to see that most of the world's uninhabited islands are probably that way because there's just no reason to bother going there. What makes an island interesting is if people do want to go there, but for some reason they can't. Going by that definition, it'd be hard to imagine a more mysterious or mesmerizing place than this one, which became a World Heritage Site in 2004. It's called Inaccessible Island. It sounds like a place from a Disney movie where some sort of treasure would be hidden, but in fact, it is a real place in the South Pacific Ocean. Just as its haunting name would have you believe, as far as we know, nobody has ever lived there. In fact, very few people have ever been there at all, and a huge portion of the island has never been reached by humans to this day. One major reason, aside from the island's remote location in the Pacific, is that it is completely surrounded by huge, steep cliffs. The best rock climbers in the world would have a hard time getting past the narrow shore. This is because Inaccessible Island is actually an extinct volcano. 6 million years ago, lava was brewing in the island's core and bursting out through the peak in the center. Today, all that's left is a bizarre and dramatic landmass that is almost perfectly designed to be impossible for humans to access. The island is part of a group of islands which make up the archipelago known as Tristan da Cunha. According to the local government, Inaccessible Island gets its name from sailors who were nervous about even going near it, because of how hard it would be to dock a ship there. The story goes that in 1778, one of the first ships to try and dock on the island was a French ship called Étoile du Matin. The captain was a Frenchman named Etrevry. He thought it might be possible to land on one of the island's narrow, rocky beaches. In the looming shadow of the wall of cliffs, Echeverry and his crew tried as hard as they could to forge a path to a safe landing. Eventually, probably fearing for their lives, they gave up. A frustrated Echeverry named the island Inaccessible Island after this dramatic defeat. In a way, he was saying, if I can't land here, nobody can. Unfortunately, it's difficult to find first-hand accounts from Captain Echeverry or anyone in his crew describing the ordeal. It's possible no such accounts were ever written down, and the story has simply been passed down over the centuries through word of mouth. However, there is another competing explanation of where the island got its name from. According to Robert K. Headland of Cambridge University, the island was actually first discovered by the Dutch in 1656. The captain of the vessel, a man named Jan Jacobsen, originally named the island after the ship which carried him there, Nachtglas, Dutch for night glass. However, Headland claims that Captain Jacobsen soon renamed the island to Inaccessible, after presumably discovering neither he nor his men could access it. As far as I can tell, this is really the extent of our knowledge when it comes to how the island was discovered, or how it got its ominous name. Information was harder to send across the ocean back then, and however many people did or did not come in contact with this mysterious place in the past, few reliable stories survive today. But whether it was Captain Jacobsen or Captain Echeverry, or someone else who coined the name Inaccessible Island, it turns out they were wrong, but they weren't kidding when they warned the rest of us that it's an insanely difficult place to get to. Since the days of captains and ships and deep-sea exploration centuries ago, modern people have made an effort to access the inaccessible, with some impressive success. In 2012, a writer for National Geographic named Andrew Evans described his wild journey to the shores of the island. According to Evans, he had tried to go there once before, but because of the island's frequent storms and choppy waters, he and his team had to turn back. On his second attempt, he had better luck, and became one of the few people in recorded history to set foot on the shores of the island. The purpose of Evans's journey was to record his observations and experiences for publication in National Geographic, but despite his palpable optimism, one of the first things Evans noticed about the coveted and supposedly untrammeled shore was that it was covered in trash. Evans says, "After the initial joy of reaching the island, I was disheartened by the trail of garbage before me, an unsightly view." He goes on to describe a rainbow assortment of plastics strewn against out on the rocks, a half-mile arc of brightly colored detritus that skittered the shore. At first, this depressing discovery might also seem somewhat baffling. How could so much trash have ended up on an island nobody has access to? The reality as explained by Evans is that trash spends months or even years floating around the ocean, eventually washing up on some shore or another. What makes Inaccessible Island unique is that there's rarely ever anybody there to pick it up. It would be interesting to compare field notes between Andrew Evans in 2012 and the various seafarers who visited the island many centuries earlier. It's a shame so little has been written about the island, but then again, it isn't surprising given its nature, and it adds considerably to its mysterious aura. Another interesting fact about the lack of people on Inaccessible Island is that it has allowed for the development of a unique wildlife environment. As you might expect with an island of this hard to get to, the most common living creatures who inhabit it are birds. In 1983, an expedition from Denstone College recorded the existence of over 16 different species of birds living on Inaccessible Island. The group counted over 3,000 individual birds. On an island that is less than 5 square miles, that's a lot. BirdLife International lists a number of these species as endangered. The unique situation with birds on the island is actually one of the primary reasons it is now included by UNESCO as a World Heritage Site. Our recent attempts to try and protect the island from human-induced damage are certainly admirable, but the truth is there just aren't very many people who ever make it there to begin with. It's ridiculously far away. It's dangerous to try and land a boat on, and even if you succeeded, there is very little terrain you can access. Who knows what's going on towards the center of the island over the tops of those imposing cliff faces? It's an undiscovered world of untouched nature, and even today, all we can really do is use our imaginations to picture what it might be like. Not all uninhabited islands are empty because they're impossible to get to. Some are forbidden. Obviously, the question on everyone's mind is, why? Of course, reasons for islands being forbidden to human entry vary from place to place. Sometimes the island sounds so terrifying it's hard to imagine wanting to go there even if it wasn't illegal. An island about 20 miles off the coast of Brazil might just be the most terrifying uninhabited island on the planet. Its official name is Ilha da Queimada Grande, which translates to Big Burnt Island. But fires aren't what makes this island famous, nor what has given it its more popular name. Locals call this place Snake Island. This is because even though the island is just 110 acres and has no human life whatsoever, it does house an extraordinary amount of another life form, venomous snakes. Estimates put the snake population of this tiny little island at over 4,000. Many of them are unique to the island too. For example, it is the only place on Earth where you can find one of the most lethal vipers that exist, the golden lancehead, which makes up more than half of the total snake population there. It's a place so horrible sounding that it can be hard to believe it's real. In 2014, a team from Vice traveled to the island with the help of the Brazilian Navy, who are the only people allowed to go there. The goal was to try and understand the story behind this unbelievable location. The team learned during their journey that there is a lighthouse on the island that has been automated since the 1920s. After the lighthouse keeper went missing, it doesn't take much imagination to recoil in horror at the thought of what may have happened to that poor soul. Both of the Vice correspondents who set foot on the island described it as by far the most awful place they had ever seen. Walking along the ground was said to be like walking through a minefield, with a snake appearing as often as every 18 square feet. They also noticed the island has stone steps leading you to its shore, which pointed to the question of how this place was first discovered, and most importantly, why there were so many snakes. The answer goes back to the formation of the island itself. 11,000 years ago, there was no island. It was still part of the South American continent. When the water level gradually rose, there came a point where wildlife living on the island could no longer leave. This created a kind of Darwinian nightmare, survival of the fittest. Spoiler alert, the snakes were the fittest. Not only the snakes, but in fact the largest, strongest, and most poisonous snakes. Eventually, these are the snakes who won out over all the less powerful, less venomous snakes. What the island was left with is a kind of empire of evolution, isolated from the rest of the world where poisonous snakes are the apex predators. Technically, it's illegal to go to this island unless you're in the Brazilian Navy or you're a special escort of the Brazilian Navy, like Vice was in 2014. But like I said, it's hard to imagine that law is really necessary. It sounds unbearable. How did anybody end up here in the first place? The island's history is not well documented, but maybe that's because anybody who has ended up there in the last 10,000 years has never left. We do know that there was a brief period where people lived on the island in order to operate the lighthouse. This period lasted from 1909 to 1920. In a relatively short time, it's no mystery why. Local legend says that the lighthouse keeper and his entire family were eaten alive by snakes. Ever since the lighthouse was automated in 1920, the only time anybody ever goes to the island now is when the Brazilian Navy does their annual inspections. Of course, the reason the lighthouse is even there in the first place is to make sure everyone else can stay far away from it. Nobody in their right mind has ever wondered why Snake Island is forbidden to visit. Yet, there are forbidden islands that seem much more appealing and are off-limits for more complex reasons. It's hard to imagine a more appealing island destination than the US state of Hawaii. Tourism results in tens of billions of dollars being spent there every year. Yet weirdly, one of the biggest islands in the entire region is totally off-limits to visitors. It's called Niihau, and since 1864 it has been privately owned by a single family, who have never allowed any outsiders to visit. There is still a native population living there as well, but it's a very small group of less than 200 people. In 1864, a woman named Elizabeth Sinclair purchased the island from the Kingdom of Hawaii for $10,000. Sinclair was originally from Scotland, and she purchased the island from King Kamehameha for ranching purposes. Since then, only the descendants of the original population and the direct descendants of Sinclair have lived on the island. Apparently, in the 150 years since, neither her family nor any of the locals have bothered to participate in such modernization. There are no traffic lights or paved roads anywhere on the island, and no running water either. The local population is entirely self-sufficient and speaks only in Hawaiian. In 1959, they were the only island in all of Hawaii that voted against becoming a US state. No one is allowed to travel to the island unless they are directly invited by Sinclair's descendants, who today are Keith and Bruce Robinson. In 2010, a travel reporter for the Los Angeles Times named Catherine Ham was invited to the island and wrote an article describing her experience. It was clearly a big deal for her. She wrote, "Since my days as a child on Oahu, I've known Niihau as the Forbidden Island." Ham says that after landing on a beach in a helicopter, she was allowed to explore freely for several hours. She didn't come across any people aside from the hired helicopter pilot who had flown her out. She did see lots of beautiful, untrammeled nature though. At one point, Ham did make one friend on the island, a monk seal who she found out was apparently known to the island's residents and had mid-named Mahina. "Even though I've now been to Niihau, I can't really say I know this Hawaiian island," she says. Part of the reason Ham didn't meet any people was because she says she was forbidden to visit the one little village on the entire island where its few residents actually live, Pu'uwai. In fact, Ham says they were only allowed to briefly fly over in the helicopter, and she caught little more than a fleeting glimpse of some houses, a school, and a church. Why is this small group of people so totally walled off from the rest of civilization? Many people, including Ham, have spent much of their lives wondering the answer to that question. Their history of avoiding technological innovation, continuing to speak the native language, and voting against becoming a state all seem to suggest a kind of Puritan survivalism in the culture. Perhaps Sinclair's descendants and the local natives share a high regard for the traditional Hawaiian way of life and don't want it altered by modernity in a way they feel would spoil it. Unfortunately, by nature, when a group of people are so walled off from the rest of the world, the rest of us can ultimately only speculate. The truth is, that's the case for pretty much any uninhabited island. They are inherently mysterious places. We're drawn to them precisely because we don't know what lurks on the interior, or we don't know why the people there won't let anybody into their secret world. In recent years, modern-day explorers and researchers like Ed Stafford or James Cameron have led the way in trying to access places humans have yet to reach, but there's still a lot of work to do, and in a world where so much is changing so rapidly, the future of these unexplored places hangs very much in the balance. One major reason these islands may change in the future is rising sea levels. In the last 30 years, sea levels have risen more than half a foot in some places. Overall, the water level is rising much faster than at any other point in recorded history. Islands like Snake Island in Brazil were first formed by rising sea levels thousands of years ago, so too they may soon be erased from existence by the same force. As horrific as all those snakes piled on top of each other are, the idea of them being forced to drown is pretty horrifying too. The same goes for any uninhabited island. Rising sea levels mean the very shape and size of the islands will change, and even on a tall island with steep cliffs like Inaccessible Island, this can still have a big impact on the ecosystem. Of course, climate change poses major existential threats to human beings and our habitats too. The US Department of Commerce estimates that close to 40% of the United States population lives in coastal areas that are vulnerable to rising sea levels. New York City and Los Angeles are the two most inhabited locations in the country, and both sit right by the ocean. In general, we're bound to be more concerned about inhabited places than uninhabited places when it comes to existential threats, but this does mean that one of the many side effects of increased climate change on Earth will be the disappearance of dramatic reshaping of the world's abandoned or forbidden islands. These islands may be harboring valuable discoveries for researchers, and as a species, we may never get to make them. Another possibility, though less likely, is that at least some of these islands will become inhabited. The United Nations recently predicted that the world's population will increase by 2 billion in the next 30 years alone. Billionaires like Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos have invested considerable funding into projects that would allow humans to live in space or on Mars. But why go to all that trouble if there's still available land on Earth? To many, it would be silly to set up a space colony when 2 million acres of land in the US is devoted just to golf courses. You could argue we haven't made the best use of all the available land on Earth as far as human survival is concerned. Small remote islands that are vulnerable to climate change definitely aren't the best option either. But who knows, maybe wealthy people who are tired of crowded cities will buy up these isolated bits of land for themselves to get away from the increasing noise and congestion of ordinary life. Believe it or not, another thing that could happen is that new islands appear where they weren't before. This is surprising and goes against our intuitive understanding of geography, but islands do actually appear all the time. In fact, just a few years ago, a new island appeared in North Carolina. Shelley Island was first spotted in 2017, and at its peak the island was over a mile long. Even more recently than that, a volcanic eruption in Tonga created a new island that disappeared again a few months later. This shows that, although sea levels are rising overall, on a similar level they are shifting and changing more and more chaotically. As crazy as it is to imagine, this could mean that in the near future, we'll see the world map continually changing, and new islands suddenly existing that have only been previously inhabited by sea creatures living underwater. Abandoned and forbidden islands are a unique phenomenon with a mysterious past, an intriguing present, and an uncertain future. Thank you for watching. We hope you enjoyed the video, and look forward to seeing you next time. Take care.